Adwa is a town in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of the countries in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia and Italy have a long history together. Prominent in their history is the bitter war which took place in 1896 in the Ethiopian city of Adwa, which saw to the destruction of more than 6,000 Italian soldiers by Ethiopian fighters who fought relentlessly to resist colonialism in that part of Africa. Ethiopia is one of the two countries in Africa that was never colonized. The other country is Liberia. In this edition of Back in History, we bring to you a short story of the Battle of Adua, a battle which remains indelible in the historical narratives of the people of Ethiopia and the Italian people. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. A couple of years back, European forces arrived to the continent of Africa and later embarked on an aggressive partitioning of the continent to themselves to suit their various interests. Virtually the whole of Africa was colonized, and the mineral resources of the continent were harnessed non-stop and taken abroad by the colonial forces. Some communities attempted to resist colonial rule, but such communities were violently crushed by the armies that came with the colonial masters. This was a regular practice at the time. Resistance to colonial rule was in fact a self-destructive mission. The colonial armies were well equipped with warfare and ready to bring down any group of people who stood on their way. In DR Congo, for instance, those that resisted King Leopold II had their hands or legs broken and severed with sharp objects. Others were killed. In some other parts of Africa, people were also killed for resisting colonial governance. In other parts of Africa, the rulers or chiefs who refused to sign treaties and cede their territories to the colonial powers were forcefully dethroned and banished to slave plantations abroad. In truth, the colonial forces had their way in the whole of Africa. Every part of Africa that had something of interest had the presence of colonial forces. But in Adwa, in Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa, the story was different. There was resistance by the local people. They had governed themselves for many years and were not prepared for any interference with their way of life. They were determined to resist colonial governance. The resistance was fierce, and the natives of Ethiopia were out to fight to the very end and secure victory for Ethiopia and stop further the spread of colonial governance in Africa. The Ethiopians had their way and succeeded in chasing the Italian soldiers and fighters out of their land, thus avoiding the wind of colonial governance which had blown across Africa at the time. A detachment of more than 6,000 Italian soldiers left Italy to Ethiopia with a mission to subdue the people there and institute colonial governance and make Italy the colonial master of Ethiopia. They went prepared and fully armed. The Italian army was commanded by army generals and supported by soldiers of other superior ranks. Assurances were given at home in Italy before their departure that Ethiopia was sure to be subdued and conquered to give way for colonial rule and expansion of Italy's influence in Africa. Adwa is a mountainous area full of rock and full of valleys. The Italians had a sketch of the area in their map and hoped to execute their battle with the aid of the map. The Ethiopian forces were also fully prepared to confront the Italians. The Ethiopian forces positioned themselves on the hills overlooking the Adwa Valley, a perfect position to attack the Italians. A serious battle ensued. The battle lasted for 3 hours in the first instance and later continued for more hours. In this battle, a total of 6,133 Italian soldiers were eliminated by the Ethiopian fighters. It is also recorded that a total of 1,428 soldiers were seriously wounded. Several others were captured alive and held hostage in Ethiopia as prisoners of war. The leading commander of the Ethiopian forces was the man known as Menelik II. For those that escaped, they escaped with fatal injuries. Some of them later passed on. It was a lost battle for the Italians, and the weight of the defeat was huge. Italy was deeply embarrassed by the turn of events, but Ethiopia was jubilant and victorious. A world power had been defeated in battle, and the bold attempt to subdue Ethiopia to colonial rulership became frustrated by the Ethiopian fighters. The online information storehouse Wikipedia narrates the situation back home in Italy as follows, following the news of the defeat of their army in Ethiopia. Quote, "When news of the calamity reached Italy, there were street demonstrations in most major cities. In Rome, to prevent these violent protests, the universities and theaters were closed. Police were called out to disperse rock throwers in front of Prime Minister Crispi's residence. Crispi resigned on 9th March. Troops were called out to quell demonstrations in Naples. In Pavia, crowds built barricades in the railroad tracks to prevent a troop train from leaving the station. The Association of Women of Rome, Turin, Milan, and Pavia called for the return of all military forces in Africa. Funeral masses were intoned for the unknown and the known dead. Families began sending to newspapers letters they had received before Adwa, in which their men described their poor living conditions and their fears at the size of the army they were going to face. King Umberto declared his birthday, 14th March, as a day of mourning. Italian communities in St. Petersburg, London, New York, Chicago, Buenos Aires, and Jerusalem collected money for the families of the dead and for the Italian Red Cross." End of quote. The Ethiopian historian Baru Zewde observed that, quote, "Few events in the modern period have brought Ethiopia to the attention of the world as the victory at Adwa." End of quote. This defeat of a colonial power and the ensuing recognition of African sovereignty became a rallying point for the late African nationalists during their struggle for decolonization, as well as activists and leaders of the Pan-African movement. After the victory over Italy in 1896, Ethiopia acquired a special importance in the eyes of Africans and black people all over the world alike, as the only surviving African state that successfully defeated a colonial power in open battle. Italy's government, who had viewed them as an inferior barbaric race, were brought to their knees and subsequently forced to recognize the African nation of Ethiopia as an equal. After Adwa, Ethiopia became emblematic of African valor and resistance, and a bastion of prestige and hope to thousands of Africans who were experiencing the full shock of Ethiopian conquest and were beginning to search for an answer to the myth of African and black inferiority, as well as invoking a strange sense of Pan-Africanism towards people of African American origins who had suffered equally appalling injustices at the time and many centuries before. There is what is called the Adwa Victory Day, which is a public holiday in all regional states and charter cities across Ethiopia. On this day, all schools, banks, post offices, and government offices are closed, with the exceptions of health facilities. Some taxi services and public transportations choose not to operate on this day. Shops are normally open, but most of the shops close earlier than usual to allow the people of Ethiopia to celebrate the victory. The victory of Adwa, being a public holiday, is commemorated in public spaces. In Addis Ababa, the victory of Adwa is celebrated at Menelik Square with the presence of government officials, patriots, foreign diplomats, and the general public. The Ethiopian Police Orchestra play various patriotic songs as they walk around Menelik Square. The public dress up in traditional Ethiopian patriotic attire. The beloved and influential wife of Emperor Menelik II, Empress Taitu Betul, played a significant role during the Battle of Adwa. Although often overlooked, thousands of women participated in the Battle of Adwa. Some were trained as nurses to attend to the wounded, and others mainly cooked and supplied food and water to the soldiers and comforted the wounded. The Battle of Adwa remains a turning point in the history of Ethiopia, and the history of the battle shall remain in the history books of the world for many more years to come. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to the channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video.